Vanishing Blood at Alderwick Station, a Miss Marple mystery. Settle in, dear listener, and allow me to take you to a place defined by schedules, signals, and the quiet certainty that trains arrive exactly as promised. Alderwick Station is not a grand terminus. It is modest, orderly, and deeply trusted by those who use it. A place where porters know the regulars by sight, where the clock is never wrong, and where nothing truly unexpected is meant to happen. Until, one morning, it does. At precisely 6:42 a.m., the station master unlocks the waiting room and finds a troubling sight. A dark smear of blood across the stone platform, fresh, unmistakable, and leading nowhere at all. No body, no injured passenger, no cries for help. By the time the first train arrives, the blood has vanished as completely as the person who spilled it. Authorities suggest an accident resolved elsewhere. A laborer's cut. A practical explanation, conveniently lacking a witness. But Miss Jane Marple, arriving later that day on an unremarkable afternoon train, notices something far more unsettling. Blood may be cleaned, traces may be erased, but fear leaves a different kind of stain. She observes the station staff, the porter who avoids the platform edge, the ticket clerk who insists nothing happened, the station master who has locked away a ledger he once kept proudly on display. She notices how quickly routine has returned, how eagerly everyone insists that Alderwick Station is functioning perfectly as usual. Miss Marple has learned to distrust places that insist on normality too strongly. For a station is not merely a place of arrivals and departures. It is a place where people pass through unnoticed, where identities blur, where a single moment, missed by the right pair of eyes, can disappear entirely. And when blood vanishes without explanation, Miss Marple knows one thing for certain. Someone left Alderwick Station that morning who was never meant to arrive anywhere at all. The stain that shouldn't exist. Alderwick Station prided itself on punctuality. The clock above Platform 2 was polished daily. Trains arrived when expected. Porters moved with practiced efficiency, their routines so reliable that regular passengers barely noticed them at all. It was the sort of place where nothing lingered, not delays, not disruptions, not questions, which was precisely why the stain was so troubling. Station Master Harold Pritchard had unlocked the waiting room at 6:40 a.m., just as he had every weekday for the past 11 years. The air was cold, the sky pale with early light, and the platform lay empty except for a single milk crate waiting to be collected. He noticed the blood immediately. It streaked across the edge of Platform 1, dark, uneven, and unmistakably fresh. Not a splash, but a smear, as though something had been dragged for several feet before abruptly stopping. Pritchard stood very still. There was no body, no collapsed passenger, no injured worker, no sound of distress echoing down the tracks. Just the stain, and the quiet certainty that it did not belong. By the time the 6:55 commuter train pulled in, the platform had been scrubbed clean. Pritchard told himself it was practical. Panic would only cause delays. A porter must have cut himself. Someone would return to report it. There was no need to involve the police over a smear that had already been removed. Still, he made an entry in the station ledger, a brief one. Miss Jane Marple arrived at Alderwick Station shortly after noon. She stepped down from the train with careful ease, her small suitcase following obediently behind her. The station looked exactly as she would have expected, orderly, modest, and eager to appear uneventful, which was, she noted, already suspicious. She paused near the platform edge, glancing down at the stonework. "New cleaning solution?" she asked mildly, addressing the porter standing nearby. The man startled. "Beg pardon?" "The stone," Miss Marple said, pointing with her umbrella. "It's lighter there." The porter's eyes flicked toward the station office. "We keep things tidy." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "But one usually cleans what is dirty, not what is already clean." The porter said nothing. Inside the station office, Harold Pritchard stiffened when he saw Miss Marple examining the notice board. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I do hope so," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I wondered whether anything unusual occurred here this morning." Pritchard's smile was immediate and unconvincing. "Nothing at all." "Not even a minor incident?" Miss Marple pressed. "A slip, perhaps? A dropped crate?" "No," Pritchard said quickly. "Entirely routine." Miss Marple nodded, then gestured toward the ledger on the desk. "You keep records," she said. "Most stations do." "Yes," Pritchard replied, his hand hovering instinctively over the book. "May I see today's entry?" Miss Marple asked. Pritchard hesitated, just long enough. "It's hardly interesting," he said. "Routine rarely is," Miss Marple replied. "But deviations are." Reluctantly, he opened the ledger. Miss Marple read the entry carefully. 6:40 a.m. Minor cleaning required. No further action. "That is an odd way to phrase it," she remarked. "It was nothing," Pritchard insisted. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But you felt compelled to record it." She closed the ledger and looked up. "People don't document nothing," she said softly. "They document concern." Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly along Platform 1, retracing the likely path of the smear. She noticed faint discoloration where the stone absorbed more water than the surrounding surface, a ghost of the stain that scrubbing could not entirely erase. Nearby, a ticket clerk pretended very hard not to watch her. "You didn't see anything this morning?" Miss Marple asked him gently. He shook his head. "No, miss." "But you heard something," Miss Marple said. The clerk's mouth tightened. "I heard a train pass early." "Earlier than scheduled?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," he admitted. "Freight. It doesn't usually stop." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And today?" she asked. The clerk swallowed. "It slowed." Miss Marple thanked him and continued walking. A freight train slowing without stopping. A smear of blood that led nowhere. A ledger entry carefully minimized. Staff united in insisting that nothing had happened. Miss Marple sat on a bench and folded her hands. Blood, she reflected, did not vanish on its own. Someone had been hurt badly enough to leave a trail, and yet no one had sought help, which meant either the injured person could not, or someone had ensured they would not. She glanced at the tracks stretching away from the station. Trains carried people forward. They also carried secrets away. And if someone had been injured here, if blood had been spilled and then erased, it meant that Alderwick Station had not merely witnessed an incident, it had facilitated a disappearance. Miss Marple rose slowly. The stain that shouldn't exist was gone. But the fear it left behind was still very much present, and it was written not on the stone, but on the faces of those who worked here. "Do you believe the blood at Alderwick Station was the result of an accident?" or the first sign of a carefully planned disappearance? Share your theory below. A platform that remembers. Miss Marple had always believed that places remembered what people tried to forget. Alderwick Station was no exception. In the early afternoon, the platform appeared entirely ordinary. Trains arrived and departed with quiet precision. Passengers consulted watches, read newspapers, and glanced impatiently toward the clock. To an untrained eye, the morning's disturbance had never existed. Miss Marple, however, noticed the way station staff moved. The porter avoided Platform 1 altogether, choosing longer routes even when they inconvenienced him. The ticket clerk lingered near the office door, glancing down the tracks far more often than necessary. And Harold Pritchard, the station master, checked the clock repeatedly, as though time itself were a thing that might betray him. Miss Marple began by doing what she always did best. She listened. At the refreshment kiosk, she overheard two commuters speaking in low voices. "They scrubbed it clean," one murmured. "Scrubbed what?" the other asked. "Never mind." Miss Marple smiled faintly and ordered tea. She took her cup to a bench near the end of Platform 1 and studied the ground carefully. Though the stone looked clean, she noticed subtle differences in texture, a faint roughness where brushes had been applied too vigorously, a slight discoloration where water had pooled and dried unevenly. Someone had panicked. Nearby, she spotted a small, almost invisible fleck caught in the groove between two stones. She bent carefully and examined it. Rust red, dry now. Blood, she suspected, but not fresh. She straightened and looked toward the tracks. Inspector Graves arrived shortly thereafter, summoned discreetly by a message Miss Marple had arranged to send earlier that morning. "You were right," he said quietly as he joined her. "They're hiding something." "They usually are," Miss Marple replied. Graves glanced at the platform. "Forensics will tell us if it's blood, but the cleaning alone suggests fear." "Fear," Miss Marple said, "is always more revealing than guilt." They walked together toward the signal box at the far end of the station. The signalman, Mr. Alfred Drew, greeted them stiffly. "You noticed anything unusual this morning?" Graves asked. Drew hesitated. "Freight train passed through early." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "We've heard." "It slowed," Drew added reluctantly. "Almost stopped." "Why?" Graves asked. Drew's eyes flicked toward the tracks. "Signal issue." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yet no report was filed." "No need," Drew said too quickly. "Resolved itself." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on. "That's two unreported irregularities," she murmured. "The stain and the train." Graves nodded. Someone didn't want records. Inside the station office, Miss Marple requested another look at the ledger. Pritchard protested weakly, but Graves' presence discouraged argument. Miss Marple turned several pages back and noted something curious. On mornings when freight trains passed through unscheduled, ledger entries were vague, times rounded, remarks minimal. "Convenient," she said softly. "That freight line connects to private sidings," Graves said. "Warehouses, storage yards." "And people," Miss Marple added. They exited the office and encountered the porter again, young, anxious, and sweating despite the cool air. "You were here this morning," Miss Marple said kindly. "Weren't you?" "Yes, miss." "And you helped clean the platform?" The porter nodded, eyes downcast. "Did you see the injured person?" Miss Marple asked. "No," he said quickly. "But you heard them?" Miss Marple pressed. The porter swallowed. "I heard someone breathing, Heavy, like they were hurt.
Graves leaned closer. Where did they go?
I don't know,
the porter said desperately.
The freight train slowed, then it was gone.
Miss Marple and Graves exchanged a glance. A person injured badly enough to bleed, unable, or prevented, from calling out, and a freight train slowing at precisely the right moment.
Someone was moved, Miss Marple said quietly. Not helped, removed.
Graves frowned. From a public station?
Yes,
Miss Marple replied.
Because everyone assumed someone else was responsible. She walked back toward the platform edge and looked down the tracks again. Freight trains did not stop at Alderwick, unless someone made them. As afternoon faded toward evening, Miss Marple noticed a man lingering near the waiting room, well-dressed, unfamiliar, and watching the station's staff rather than the schedule. When he caught her eye, he turned away quickly. "Who is that?" she asked the ticket clerk casually. The clerk hesitated. "He's waiting." "For which train?" Miss Marple asked. The clerk checked the board. "None today." Miss Marple nodded and returned to her bench. The picture was forming now. A person had been injured or attacked at Alderwick Station early that morning. Instead of seeking help, station staff had been instructed, coerced perhaps, to clean, minimize, and forget. A freight train, conveniently slowed, had provided an opportunity to remove someone unseen, not murdered on the platform, but vanished from it. Miss Marple folded her hands. The stain had been erased, but the platform remembered, and so did she. Do you think the freight train was used to rescue someone, or to make sure they were never found? Share your theory below. The train that wasn't on the board. Miss Marple had always found timetables comforting. They represented order, promises written in ink, assumptions that people built their days around. But she also knew that the most important movements rarely appeared on public schedules. What mattered was not what was printed on the board, but what happened when no one was meant to be watching. At Alderwick Station, the freight train was not on the board. Miss Marple returned to the platform just before dusk, choosing the hour deliberately. Evening brought with it a different rhythm, fewer passengers, longer shadows, and staff who believed the day's scrutiny had passed. She took a seat near the signal box and waited. Inspector Graves joined her moments later. "I've spoken to the rail office," he said quietly. "There was no authorized stop scheduled this morning." "No stop," Miss Marple replied, "but a slowdown." "Yes," Graves said. "Approved verbally, no paperwork." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked. Graves hesitated. "By the station master." Miss Marple nodded. Authority is often lent casually. They watched as a late commuter train departed, the platform emptying quickly. When the last passenger had gone, Miss Marple stood and walked toward the signal box. Mr. Alfred Drew was alone inside, adjusting levers with practiced movements. "You enjoy your work?" Miss Marple observed pleasantly. Drew looked startled. "I do my duty." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and that includes remembering things others prefer to forget." Drew stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied. "Then perhaps you can help me understand why the freight train slowed this morning." Drew's jaw tightened. Signal irregularity. "And the signal log?" Miss Marple asked. Drew hesitated, just long enough. "There is no log," he said. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "There should be." Drew's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a drawer and produced a folded sheet of paper.
Miss Marple examined it carefully. The times were handwritten, the ink darker than the surrounding entries.
And the notation beside the freight train read simply, "Proceed cautiously." "That is not standard phrasing," Miss Marple said gently. "No," Drew admitted. "It was suggested." "By the station master," Graves said. "And someone else," Miss Marple added quietly. They returned to the platform as night settled. Miss Marple noticed something she had missed earlier, a narrow maintenance stair leading down from Platform 1 toward the tracks, partially obscured by a storage shed. "Does that see much use?" she asked. Drew shook his head. "Only for inspections." "And this morning?" Miss Marple pressed. He did not answer. Miss Marple descended the steps slowly. Near the bottom she found what she was looking for, a smear on the metal railing, faint, rusty, missed by hurried cleaning. And beneath it, a darkened patch in the gravel where liquid had pooled and soaked in. Blood did not vanish on its own. Someone had been moved down these steps. "An injured person could be lowered," Graves said quietly. "Hidden from the platform." "And loaded onto a slowing freight train," Miss Marple finished. They climbed back up. "That requires cooperation," Graves said. "More than one person." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And incentive." She returned to the station office and asked to see the parcel registry. Harold Pritchard protested, but Miss Marple's calm persistence prevailed. Among the entries, she noticed one marked unusually, "Special handling, early transfer." "What was transferred?" she asked. "Machinery parts," Pritchard said too quickly. "And the sender?" Miss Marple asked. Pritchard hesitated. "A private contractor." "Which one?" Graves demanded. Pritchard's shoulders sagged. "I don't know." Miss Marple closed the ledger. "Then let me suggest a possibility," she said gently. "The freight train was not used to move goods. It was used to move a person." Pritchard looked ill. "That person was injured on this platform," Miss Marple continued, "and rather than summon help, rather than explain why someone was hurt here, you chose discretion." "No one was meant to die," Pritchard whispered. "Vanishing," Miss Marple replied softly, "is not the same as surviving." As they left the office, Miss Marple noticed the well-dressed man again, still lingering, still watching. This time she followed him. He exited the station quickly, heading down the lane toward the old goods yard. Miss Marple did not hurry. She rarely needed to. At the edge of the yard, the man turned and spoke first. "You're very observant," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It's a habit." He smiled thinly. "You should be careful where you look." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "People who say that," she replied, "usually hope someone else won't." As the man walked away, Miss Marple knew one thing with certainty. The freight train had not carried an accident victim. It had carried a problem. And the problem was not finished yet. Do you think the injured person was helped onto the freight train or removed against their will? Share your theory below. The man who should have boarded. Miss Marple had learned, over many years, that disappearances were rarely about escape. More often they were about interruption, someone prevented from doing what they had fully intended to do. At Otterwick Station, someone should have boarded a train that morning. The question was not who vanished, but who was expected. Miss Marple began the day with the passenger manifests. Inspector Graves had arranged access to the booking records. Though the station master's discomfort was obvious, as the ledgers were placed on the desk. "Most people don't reserve seats here," Harold Pritchard said defensively. "Short journeys, local traffic." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but those who do often matter." She scanned the entries for the early morning trains. One name appeared that caught her attention, not because it stood out, but because it stopped. Thomas Keel. Ticket purchased 3 days earlier. Single journey. Departure, 6:55 a.m. "He never boarded," Pritchard said quickly. "Must have changed his plans." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps he never had the chance." Graves leaned closer. "Who is he?" Pritchard hesitated. "A clerk, recently transferred. Quiet fellow." Miss Marple closed the ledger. "Quiet people are often the most dangerous to secrets." They left the office and walked toward Platform 1. Miss Marple stopped at the exact point where the blood smear had been first reported. "If a man were attacked here," she said, "it would be quick, early hour, few witnesses." "And the freight train slowing would cover movement," Graves added. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but only if someone knew he would be here." They located Thomas Keel's lodging house later that morning, a modest residence a short walk from the station. The landlady answered the door with visible relief. "I was wondering when someone would ask," she said. "Did Mr. Keel return yesterday?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No," the woman replied. "He left early. Said he had a meeting in London. Promised to settle his account in the evening." "And you haven't seen him since?" Graves asked. The landlady shook her head. "He left his papers behind." Miss Marple examined the items laid out on the small table, receipts, notes, and a folded envelope marked simply, "Alderwick, urgent." Inside was a typed letter. "I have confirmed irregularities connected to freight movements at Alderwick Station. Records altered. Staff pressured. This cannot continue." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "He wasn't a clerk," she said quietly. "He was an auditor." Graves exhaled slowly. So someone expected him and didn't want him boarding that train. They returned to the station with new urgency. Miss Marple observed staff reactions carefully now. When she mentioned Thomas Keel's name casually near the refreshment stand, the porter flinched. When she asked the ticket clerk about auditors, he looked away. And when she spoke the name near the well-dressed man, now seated confidently in the waiting room, he smiled. "So you found him," he said. "Found about him," Miss Marple corrected. He rose smoothly. "My name is Charles Fenwick. I represent a logistics firm that uses the freight line." "Regularly?" Miss Marple asked. "Discreetly," Fenwick replied. "Discretion," Miss Marple said, "often walks hand in hand with fear." Fenwick's smile thinned. "Mr. Keel misunderstood certain operations." "And paid for it?" Miss Marple asked. Fenwick leaned closer. "You should stop asking questions." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "People who vanish," she said calmly, "always leave questions behind. You cannot erase both." Inspector Graves stepped forward. Fenwick straightened. "We'll be speaking again," Graves said. Fenwick shrugged lightly. "You won't find a body?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But we may find a train." That evening Miss Marple reviewed freight routes with Graves. "Where would a slowing train take someone?" she asked. "To a private siding," Graves replied. "Unregistered transfer points." "And survival?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Graves did not answer.
Miss Marple sat back, her expression thoughtful. Thomas Keel had arrived at Alderwick Station intending to expose a system. Instead, he had become part of it, removed, hidden, reclassified as cargo. The blood on the platform had not marked an accident. It had marked resistance.
And now that Miss Marple knew who should have boarded the train, and why, she knew something else as well. Whoever orchestrated this disappearance believed that trains erased responsibility. But trains, like people, always left tracks. Do you believe Thomas Keel is still alive? Or was the freight train meant to silence him permanently? Share your theory below. Cargo that was never logged. Miss Marple had always found that once a person was reduced to an object, an inconvenience, a delay, a problem, it became dangerously easy to stop thinking of them as human at all. At Alderwick Station, Thomas Keel had been turned into cargo. The discovery that Keel was an auditor, not a clerk, shifted the atmosphere of the investigation instantly. What had once felt like nervous secrecy now carried the sharper edge of calculation.
Miss Marple sensed it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the hurried politeness that replaced denial. Inspector Graves met her early the next morning in the station office. "We've confirmed Keel's assignment," he said. "Unofficial audit, financial irregularities tied to freight transfers, missing documentation." "And Alderwick?" Miss Marple asked. "Central," Graves replied. "Quiet, overlooked, useful." Miss Marple nodded. Places that pride themselves on efficiency rarely like attention. They examined the freight registry together. Page after page listed routine consignments, coal, machine parts, agricultural supplies. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then Miss Marple noticed it. A single entry stamped "Cleared, no weight recorded." "That is not standard," she said softly. "No," Graves agreed.
Weight is always recorded.
"And yet," Miss Marple said, "someone chose not to."
Graves tapped the page. "This entry corresponds with the morning Keel disappeared."
Miss Marple closed the ledger.
"A person," she said, "does not weigh nothing."
They walked out to the goods yard behind the station. The area was quiet now, the tracks unused except for occasional freight movements late at night. Miss Marple studied the siding carefully. "Someone could load cargo here unseen," she said, "especially early in the morning."
"Yes," Graves replied, "and unload it elsewhere just as quietly."
"Or not unload it at all," Miss Marple added. They were interrupted by the porter, who approached hesitantly. "I didn't want to," he said suddenly. "I swear I didn't." Miss Marple turned to him gently. "Tell us what you did do." The young man swallowed.
"I was told to help move a crate. Just one. No markings. Heavier than usual."
"He?"
Miss Marple asked. The porter hesitated. "Mr. Fenwick and the station master." Graves stiffened. "They said it was urgent," the porter continued. "That paperwork would come later."
"And did you hear anything?" Miss Marple asked quietly.
The porter's voice dropped. "Someone coughed."
Silence settled over the yard. Miss Marple did not close her eyes. She had learned long ago that imagination was often kinder than reality. "After that?" she asked.
"They told me to forget it," the porter whispered. "Said I'd lose my job if I didn't."
Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his sleeve. "You've done well to speak now." Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves confronted Harold Pritchard. The station master looked older than he had days before.
"I didn't hurt anyone," Pritchard insisted. "I just followed instructions."
"Whose?"
Graves demanded.
Pritchard's gaze dropped. Fenwick's. He said the man was dangerous, that he was interfering with national supply routes. And you believed him, Miss Marple said gently. I believed he had authority, Pritchard replied. Yes, Miss Marple said. That is often enough. They left Pritchard to formal questioning and returned to the platform. Miss Marple stood once more where the blood had been. Keel resisted, she said quietly. Enough to bleed. And enough to be silenced, Graves replied grimly. Miss Marple shook her head. No, enough to be removed. They reviewed Fenwick's firm next, a logistics company with government contracts, vague oversight, and a history of expedited transfers. Disappearing paperwork, Graves said.
Disappearing people. That, Miss Marple replied, is not logistics. It is exploitation. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat alone on a bench at the far end of Platform 1. She imagined the scene clearly now. Thomas Keel arrives early, intending to board the 6:55. He carries evidence, papers that threaten a system built on quiet efficiency. Someone is waiting. Words are exchanged. Keel refuses to be delayed. Then force, a fall, blood, panic, not because someone was hurt, but because someone was seen. So the system activates. The freight train slows, the crate is fetched, the ledger is altered, the platform is scrubbed, and a man becomes cargo. Miss Marple folded her hands. The crime at Alderwick Station was not murder, not yet. It was something colder. A decision that Thomas Keel did not matter enough to be protected. And Miss Marple knew that such crimes rarely ended where they began, because systems that erase people do not stop willingly. They must be interrupted. Do you think Thomas Keel was still alive when he was loaded onto the freight train? Or was the cover-up already complete? Share your theory below. A man who was not supposed to breathe. Miss Marple had long believed that the most dangerous assumption in any investigation was certainty. At Alderwick Station, certainty had taken a very specific form. The quiet, unspoken belief that Thomas Keel was already dead. The blood, the crate, the altered ledgers, all pointed comfortably in that direction. A tragic disappearance, efficiently concealed. But comfort, Miss Marple knew, was often the enemy of truth. Inspector Graves arrived early that morning, with news that shifted the ground beneath their feet. The freight line connects to a private siding near Marrow Fen, he said. Abandoned warehouse. No recent permits. And the crate? Miss Marple asked. Delivered, Graves replied, but not logged as destroyed. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Then someone expected it to arrive intact, she said quietly. They drove to Marrow Fen under a sky heavy with low cloud. The warehouse sat at the edge of marshland, its windows boarded, its doors rusted but recently disturbed. Tire tracks cut through the mud, sharp and unmistakable. Inside, the air smelled of oil, damp wood, and something else, metallic, faint, unsettling. Graves signaled for silence. Near the far wall, Miss Marple noticed the crate immediately. Its lid had been pried open roughly, nails bent outward. One side bore a dark stain, hastily wiped. And then she heard it. Breathing. Shallow, uneven, human. Graves moved quickly, wrenching the crate fully open. Thomas Keel lay inside, pale, bloodied, but unmistakably alive. Miss Marple closed her eyes, not in relief, but in quiet recognition. He was never meant to be,
she said softly. Keel's injuries were serious but survivable. A fractured arm, a head wound, shock. He drifted in and out of consciousness as paramedics were summoned. When he could speak, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "They said it would be easier if I stayed quiet." "Who did?" Graves asked. Keel swallowed. "Fenwick and the station master helped. They said I was disrupting essential operations." Miss Marple leaned closer.
"Did you agree to go with them?" Keel's eyes opened weakly.
No. That single word carried more weight than all the ledgers combined. Back at the station, news spread quickly, though not officially. Whispers raced ahead of announcements. The porter avoided eye contact, the ticket clerk looked ill, and Charles Fenwick was gone. "They've tipped him off," Graves said grimly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "People who rely on systems know when they are about to fail." She returned to Platform 1 alone that evening. The station felt different now, exposed. The stain was gone, but the story could no longer be erased. Miss Marple imagined Thomas Keel lying in the crate, breathing carefully, listening to the train's metal rhythm carry him away. He had been meant to disappear quietly. Instead, he had survived loudly enough to unravel everything.
Miss Marple stood and looked down the tracks one final time. Systems depended on two things: silence and certainty. Fenwick had relied on both, and now he had neither. Do you think Fenwick intended Thomas Keel to survive, or was the crate always meant to become a coffin? Share your thoughts below. Who looked away? Miss Marple had never believed that crimes of this nature belonged solely to those who planned them. They belonged equally to those who allowed them. Alderwick Station entered a peculiar state of suspension once news of Thomas Keel's survival began to circulate. Official statements were still cautious, still incomplete, but the truth had slipped its leash. The village sensed it, and with that awareness came discomfort far more unsettling than fear. People began remembering things. The porter remembered being told not to ask questions. The ticket clerk remembered hearing raised voices near Platform 1. The signalman remembered the hesitation before pulling the lever. Memory, Miss Marple reflected, was often activated by consequence. Inspector Graves convened a series of interviews in the station office. Miss Marple remained present, quiet, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. "You knew he was hurt," Graves said to the station master, Harold Pritchard. "I knew he was bleeding," Pritchard replied hoarsely. "Fenwick said it wasn't serious." "And you believed him," Miss Marple said gently. Pritchard's shoulders sagged. "He spoke with authority. Papers, confidence." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Authority often does." The porter spoke next, his voice shaking. "They told me the man had agreed that it was safer this way." "And did you see agreement?" Miss Marple asked. "No," the porter admitted. "I saw fear." That word settled heavily over the room. Outside, villagers gathered near the platform, quiet, uncertain, watching the place they had trusted reveal itself as something else entirely. Miss Marple walked among them later that afternoon, listening without interruption. "We didn't know," one woman said. "We suspected," another corrected. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "and there is a difference." She stopped near the edge of Platform 1 and turned back to them. "Thomas Keel survived," she said, "but survival does not erase responsibility." That evening, Inspector Graves received confirmation.
Charles Fenwick had been located attempting to cross into another county using false documentation. He ran, Graves said grimly.
Yes, Miss Marple replied, because systems only protect those inside them. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her room and wrote a brief letter, one she had written many times before in other places with different names. It was addressed to the Railway Oversight Board. Sometimes, she knew, justice required more than a culprit. It required reform. Later that night, as a late train passed through Alderwick Station without stopping, Miss Marple stood at her window and listened to the sound fade into the distance. Trains moved on, but places remembered. And Alderwick Station would remember this moment, not because blood had been spilled here, but because someone had finally refused to pretend it hadn't mattered. Do you believe the station staff were victims of pressure or accomplices through silence? Share your thoughts below. When systems begin to fracture. Miss Marple had often observed that systems did not collapse when exposed. They collapsed when they were forced to explain themselves. At Alderwick Station, that moment had arrived. The morning after Fenwick fled, officials appeared, not policemen alone, but clerks, auditors, and inspectors, quiet people with clipboards and careful handwriting. They asked polite questions. They requested documentation. They measured, recorded, and compared. And slowly, the station began to unravel. Miss Marple sat on a bench near the booking office, knitting calmly as the investigation unfolded around her. She did not interfere. She rarely needed to. Once the right questions were being asked, answers tended to surface on their own. Harold Pritchard looked smaller now, his confidence eroded by forms he could not complete and logs he could not explain. "They're asking about weight records," he murmured to Miss Marple during a brief pause. "From years back." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "People rarely start questioning systems at the point where they fail. They begin where they were built." Nearby, Inspector Graves was speaking with the signalman. "You approved freight slowdowns without documentation," Graves said. "I was told it was authorized," the man replied weakly. "By whom?" Graves asked. The signalman hesitated. "By people who didn't put things in writing." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. That afternoon, news arrived from Marrow Fen. Thomas Keel had regained full consciousness. Graves returned with the update, his expression grim but determined. "He's talking now," he said. "Fully." "And?" Miss Marple asked. "He says Fenwick wasn't alone," Graves replied. "There were others, contractors, supervisors, names he couldn't confirm before." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because systems prefer anonymity." She rose and walked slowly toward Platform 1, where a small group of villagers had gathered again. This time they were not whispering. "They moved him like cargo," one man said bitterly. "And we let them," another replied. Miss Marple stopped beside them. "Silence," she said gently, "is not passive. It is active cooperation." A woman near the back looked stricken. "What were we supposed to do?" "Ask," Miss Marple replied, "and then keep asking." That evening, Inspector Graves received confirmation that Fenwick had been detained. "They found him at a depot outside the county," he said. "He tried to destroy documents." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "People rarely flee empty-handed." Graves hesitated. "You know, Miss Marple, this won't end with him." "No," she said, "nor should it." As night settled, Miss Marple returned to the platform alone. The station clock ticked steadily.
Trains continued to arrive and depart. To an outsider, Alderwick still appeared functional, efficient, unchanged. But Miss Marple knew better. The illusion had cracked. Once people realized that systems could be questioned, that authority could be mistaken, that convenience could cost lives, nothing ever returned to quite the same shape again. She folded her knitting and looked down the tracks. Thomas Keel had survived not because the system spared him, but because it failed to finish its work cleanly. And that failure, small, overlooked, perfect, had exposed everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perfection, she had learned, was always suspicious. "Do you think dismantling the system will be enough, or will another quietly replace it?" Share your thoughts below. The price of vanishing. Miss Marple had long ago accepted that justice rarely arrived as a single moment. More often, it unfolded slowly through paperwork, testimony, and the uncomfortable realization that the truth could not be folded away again. At Alderwick Station, that realization had become unavoidable. The formal inquiry began on a Monday morning, announced not by sirens or crowds, but by a neatly typed notice pinned beside the timetable board. Inspectors arrived in quiet succession. Ledgers were sealed. Offices were locked. The station continued to function, but under observation now, its routines examined rather than trusted. Miss Marple observed it all from a bench near platform 2. Inspector Graves joined her shortly after midday. "Fenwick has agreed to cooperate," he said. "Partially." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "People often do, when cooperation becomes their only remaining asset." Graves exhaled. He confirmed the system existed long before Alderwick. Freight slowdowns, unlogged transfers, pressure placed on station masters to comply. "And Thomas Keel?" Miss Marple asked. "He was meant to be delayed," Graves replied. "Intimidated. Removed from the process long enough for the audit to collapse." "But not killed," Miss Marple said. Graves nodded. "Not officially." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the tracks. "Intent," she said softly, "is rarely written down." That afternoon, Thomas Keel arrived at the station for the first time since his disappearance. He moved slowly, supported by a cane, his face still pale but determined. When he stepped onto platform 1, conversation faltered around him. Staff froze. Passengers stared. Miss Marple rose and approached him. "You've returned," she said gently. "Yes," Keel replied. "I needed to see it again." "Places like this," Miss Marple said, "benefit from being remembered." Keel nodded. "They thought I'd disappear quietly." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but disappearance is rarely as final as people hope." Keel provided his testimony later that day. He described the confrontation, Fenwick's calm certainty, the station master's hesitation, the sudden violence when he refused to delay his findings. He described the crate, the darkness, the careful breathing required to stay conscious. "They spoke about schedules," he said quietly, "about efficiency." Miss Marple listened from the back of the room, her hands folded. People who reduced lives to logistics always spoke in that language. When the hearings adjourned, Miss Marple encountered Harold Pritchard outside the station office. He looked hollow. "I thought I was protecting my job," he said, "my station." "And instead," Miss Marple said gently, "you endangered a life." "Yes," he whispered. She nodded. "That is the price of vanishing others. One eventually vanishes oneself." from trust. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her room and packed slowly. The work here was nearly finished. Others would carry it forward now, inspectors, auditors, committees. Her role was complete. Before leaving the next morning,
She walked once more along Platform 1. The stone was clean, the air calm. Trains arrived and departed exactly as scheduled. Yet Alderwick Station no longer felt invisible. People watched now. They asked questions. They noticed pauses where none should exist. Miss Marple paused at the platform edge and looked down the tracks. Vanishing, she reflected, was never about absence. It was about permission, and that permission had been withdrawn. Do you believe true justice lies in punishment, or in making sure systems like this can never operate again? Share your thoughts below. Miss Marple had always believed that places did not forget. People did. On the morning she prepared to leave Alderwick, the station looked much as it always had. The clock above Platform 2 ticked steadily. Porters moved crates with unhurried efficiency. The scent of coal smoke and damp stone lingered faintly in the air. To the casual observer, nothing suggested that this modest station had recently stood at the center of a carefully constructed disappearance. Yet Miss Marple felt the difference immediately. There was hesitation now where there had once been certainty. She arrived early, well before her train was due, and took a seat on Platform 1. The stone beneath her feet had been scrubbed clean days ago, yet the platform felt altered, not stained, but aware. People glanced at it more often than necessary, as though expecting it to speak. Inspector Graves joined her, carrying a thin folder. "It's finished," he said quietly. "Fenwick has been formally charged. The logistics firm is under investigation.
Several supervisors have resigned."
"And the station?" Miss Marple asked.
New oversight, Graves replied. New procedures, written ones. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Writing things down has a way of slowing people. Graves hesitated. Thomas Keel asked about you. Oh? Miss Marple said. He wanted to thank you. Miss Marple shook her head gently. That won't be necessary. They watched as Thomas Keel crossed the platform slowly, leaning on his cane. He paused near the spot where he had fallen, where his blood had once marked the stone. I remember thinking, he said quietly, not looking at either of them, that if I stayed conscious, someone would have to decide what to do with me. And they did, Miss Marple replied. Yes, Keel said. They decided I was inconvenient. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Inconvenience, she said,
is often the beginning of accountability. Keel nodded. I won't forget this place. No, Miss Marple agreed. Nor should you. As he moved away, Miss Marple rose and walked slowly along the platform edge. She noticed small changes everywhere. A porter now checked a manifest twice instead of once. The signalmen logged every adjustment carefully. The station master, no longer Harold Pritchard, stood visibly, deliberately present. Visibility, Miss Marple reflected, was the enemy of abuse. Her train's whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Miss Marple returned to her bench and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Alderwick Station had not been evil. That was the troubling part. It had been efficient, cooperative, polite, a place where people trusted systems more than questions and authority more than conscience. Thomas Keel had arrived believing paperwork would protect him. Instead, it was ordinary hesitation,
The unwillingness of a porter to look too closely, the ease with which a station master deferred responsibility, the confidence of a man who spoke as though legality were optional that nearly erased him. Miss Marple glanced once more at Platform 1. The blood had vanished quickly, too quickly, yet the consequences had not. She stood as her train pulled in, steam curling gently around the platform. As she stepped aboard, she looked back, not searching for drama, not expecting farewell, just checking. Alderwick Station stood quietly behind her, doing what it had always done. Only now it was being watched. As the train moved off, Miss Marple settled into her seat and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile.
Somewhere else, in another place governed by schedules and silence, someone was relying on the same assumptions that had nearly succeeded here. Someone believed that movement erased responsibility, that disappearance ended questions. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Platforms remembered. And as long as there were people willing to notice what others ignored, no system, no matter how efficient, could erase a human life without leaving a trace behind. Do you believe Alderwick Station truly changed? Or will time tempt it back into comfortable silence? Share your final thoughts in the comments below. After the trains have gone. And so, dear listener, Alderwick Station returns to its familiar rhythm. Trains arrive, trains depart. The clock above the platform continues its steady marking of time. To most, it is once again an unremarkable place, just another stop along a well-worn line. Yet something essential is changed. The platform remembers what happened here, not in stains or damage, but in awareness. People pause now. They ask questions. They read ledgers instead of trusting them. They notice when schedules shift and when explanations arrive too smoothly. Thomas Keel survives, not because the system spared him, but because it failed to erase him completely. His blood was cleaned away, his name briefly forgotten, yet his presence forced Alderwick to confront a truth it preferred not to see. That efficiency without accountability is simply another form of cruelty. Miss Marple leaves the station without ceremony, as she always does. She carries no proof with her, no trophies of justice, only the quiet satisfaction that comes from noticing what others ignored. Her work is never about spectacle. It is about attention. Because crimes like this are not committed in darkness. They happen in daylight, in ordinary places, under the protection of routine and silence. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of Alderwick Station, that disappearance does not begin with violence. It begins with permission, and it ends only when someone refuses to grant it. Thank you for sharing this journey into the hidden workings of an everyday place. If this mystery stayed with you, tell me which moment felt most unsettling and why. Until our next story together, take care, and remember, when something vanishes without explanation, it is always worth asking who benefited from its absence.